August 14, 1944. A narrow road through the Normandy Bocage, 3 miles south of Mortain. Private First Class Arthur Jennings crouched in the hedgerow with 16 other American soldiers, watching the German convoy approach through the morning mist. Kübelwagens, the German equivalent of jeeps, rolling in a tight column down a road that appeared completely clear and safe. The Germans had no reason to suspect danger. This was their territory, a supply route they had used for weeks without incident. The lead vehicle's driver was relaxed, one arm resting on the door, cigarette dangling from his lips. Behind him, 15 more vehicles followed at regulation intervals, carrying officers, messengers, and supplies for the Wehrmacht units trying to hold the line against the Allied breakout. Arthur's hands were sweating. His heart was pounding so hard, he was certain the Germans could hear it. Everything depended on the next few seconds. Everything he had spent 2 weeks building. 2 weeks of being mocked and dismissed and told he was wasting time on a fool's errand. The steel cables stretched across the road were invisible in the early light. They were positioned at exactly the height Arthur had calculated, exactly the tension he had measured, exactly the angle that would transform a moving vehicle into a tumbling wreck. The lead Kübelwagen hit the first cable at 30 miles per hour. The effect was instantaneous and catastrophic. The cable caught the vehicle just below the hood line, and the Jeep's own momentum did the rest. The front end stopped, the rear end kept moving, and the entire vehicle flipped forward, rotating through the air like a coin tossed by a giant, crashing onto its roof in a spray of dust and shattered glass. The second vehicle had no time to react. It hit the cable and flipped. The third, the fourth, the fifth. In 11 seconds, 16 German Kübelwagens lay overturned on the road, their wheels spinning uselessly in the air, their occupants dead or stunned or struggling to escape from the wreckage. A convoy that should have delivered vital supplies to the German front lines had been destroyed without a single shot fired. And Arthur Jennings, the quiet kid from rural Pennsylvania, who everyone had called crazy, stood in the hedgerow watching his impossible trap work exactly as he had promised, watching the officers who had laughed at him realize they had been completely, utterly wrong. If you are watching from anywhere in the world, take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel. We bring you stories from World War II that reveal what happens when ordinary soldiers refuse to accept impossible situations, when one person's unconventional thinking changes everything. Tell us in the comments where you are watching from today. These stories survive because we remember them together. Arthur Jennings was born in 1924 in the Allegheny Mountains of western Pennsylvania, the youngest of 5 children in a family that had lived off the land for generations. His father, Elmer Jennings, was a trapper and hunter who supplemented the family's meager farm income by selling pelts and guiding wealthy hunters from Pittsburgh who came to the mountains seeking deer and bear. The Jennings homestead sat at the end of a dirt road that became impassable for months each winter, a ramshackle collection of buildings that housed the family, their animals, and the accumulated equipment of 100 years of mountain living. There was no electricity, no running water, no connection to the modern world, except for the battery-powered radio that brought news of distant events that seemed to have nothing to do with their lives. Arthur grew up in the woods. By the time he was 8, he could set a rabbit snare that would catch dinner without damaging the pelt. By 12, he could build a deadfall trap that would take down a black bear. By 16, he understood the mathematics of trapping in ways that no textbook could teach, the relationship between trigger sensitivity and target weight, the physics of falling objects and spring tension, the art of concealment that made the difference between a successful trap and an empty one. His father taught him that trapping was not about brute force. Any fool could dig a pit and hope something fell in. The art was in understanding your prey, knowing how it moved, what it expected, where its attention would be focused, what would make it step exactly where you wanted it to step. A good trap exploited these patterns, using the animal's own behavior against it. The philosophy extended beyond the technical aspects of trap making. Elmer believed that a trapper had to think like his prey, to understand its world from the inside, to predict its decisions before they were made. This required patience, observation, and a willingness to spend hours watching and waiting before taking any action. The most important lesson came when Arthur was 14. His father took him to a stream crossing where deer came to drink, a spot they had hunted for years. But this time, instead of setting up for a shot, Elmer spent 3 days building an elaborate cable snare that would catch a deer by its legs as it stepped into the water. Arthur watched with growing impatience. Why go through all this trouble when a rifle shot would accomplish the same thing in seconds? His father's answer stayed with Arthur forever, shaping the way he thought about problems for the rest of his life. A rifle tells everyone in the valley where you are. A trap is silent. A rifle requires you to be there at the right moment. A trap waits for the right moment to come to it. A rifle can miss. A good trap never misses. The snare worked perfectly that night, catching a 6-point buck that would have been almost impossible to take with a rifle in the dense brush. Arthur began to see trapping not as a primitive alternative to modern hunting, but as a sophisticated technology in its own right, one that traded immediate action for patient preparation and force for intelligence. When war came in 1941, Arthur was 17 years old, too young to enlist immediately but old enough to understand that the world he had known was changing forever. He spent a year working on the family farm, following the news from Europe and the Pacific with growing anxiety. His older brothers had already enlisted, one in the army, now fighting somewhere in the Pacific, one in the Navy, stationed at a base in California, and Arthur counted the days until he could join them, until he could prove himself in the larger world beyond the mountains. He enlisted on his 18th birthday in January 1943 and was assigned to the infantry after basic training. His scores on marksmanship tests were excellent, but what impressed his instructors most was his performance in the fieldcraft exercises, the ability to move silently through terrain, to read tracks and signs, to anticipate where an enemy might appear. One instructor, a sergeant who had fought in the First War, pulled Arthur aside after an exercise and asked where he had learned such skills. When Arthur explained about trapping, the sergeant nodded slowly. "You think different," the sergeant said. "Most soldiers think about shooting, you think about catching. That might be useful someday." Arthur did not know how right the sergeant would prove to be. Arthur Jennings landed at Utah Beach on June 15, 1944, 9 days after D-Day, stepping off a landing craft into water that came up to his chest and wading toward a shore that was still littered with the debris of the invasion. Burned-out vehicles, abandoned equipment, and the occasional covered body marked the path of the men who had come before him. He was assigned to the 30th Infantry Division, which was pushing inland through the hedgerow country that the French called Bocage and that American soldiers would learn to call hell. The Bocage was a nightmare, unlike anything the army had anticipated. For centuries, Norman farmers had divided their fields with earthen walls topped by dense hedges, creating a landscape of small enclosed pastures separated by barriers that were nearly impenetrable to vehicles and deadly to infantry. Each field was a potential fortress. Each hedgerow concealed German machine guns and mortars. The Americans had expected to race across France after breaking out of the beaches. Instead, they found themselves fighting for every yard. Arthur's unit advanced through this maze at an agonizing pace, taking casualties that seemed out of proportion to the ground gained. German defenders could hide behind any hedgerow, wait for Americans to cross an open field, and cut them down with interlocking fields of fire. The attackers never knew which hedgerow was defended until they were already dying. The experience changed Arthur in ways he could not fully articulate. He had trained for combat, had prepared himself mentally for the violence of war, but nothing had prepared him for the grinding frustration of fighting an enemy who refused to stand and face him. The Germans were invisible, patient, deadly. They used the terrain the way Arthur's father had used the Pennsylvania woods, not as a battlefield, but as a trap. The comparison lodged in Arthur's mind and would not leave. He began to see the war differently, not as a clash of armies, but as a contest of traps and counter-traps, each side trying to predict the other's movements and exploit them. One afternoon in late July, pinned down behind a hedgerow while German fire shredded the air above him, Arthur found himself thinking about something his father had said years ago, sitting by the fire after a successful hunt. The best trap doesn't fight the animal. It uses the animal's own strength against it. The harder the animal struggles, the tighter the trap holds. That's the secret. Make their strength work for you. The Germans were using the Bocage as a trap. The hedgerows channeled American movement into predictable paths. The open fields were killing grounds. The Americans were the prey, walking into ambush after ambush because they had no choice but to advance. But what if the Americans could set their own traps? What if they could use the same principles against German vehicles and supplies? Arthur began watching the roads with new attention. He noticed how German supply convoys moved at specific times, using specific routes. He observed the Kübelwagens that carried messages and officers between units, always in a hurry, always following the same narrow lanes between the hedgerows. He saw patterns that reminded him of animal trails back home, predictable movements that could be exploited, and he began to imagine a trap. The idea was simple in concept: stretch steel cables across a road at a height calculated to catch vehicles just below the hood line, creating a tripwire that would flip them over at speed. The physics were straightforward. A moving vehicle's momentum, when suddenly arrested at one point, would cause the rear to rotate over the front. The result would be catastrophic for the occupants and any vehicles following behind. Arthur had seen something similar back home, years ago. A neighbor's cow had gotten tangled in a wire fence, and in its panicked attempt to escape, had flipped itself completely over. The memory had stayed with him, a mental note about how momentum and sudden obstruction could combine to produce unexpected results. But simple concepts required complex execution. Arthur spent every spare moment calculating and planning, filling a small notebook with diagrams and numbers that his squadmates found incomprehensible. The cable height was critical. Too high and it would pass over the hood. Too low, and the vehicle might ride over it or push it down. Arthur estimated the average height of a Kübelwagen's hood at about 24 inches, so the cable needed to be positioned at approximately 20 inches, low enough to catch but high enough to flip. The cable tension was equally important. Too loose and the cable would simply stretch and drag, slowing the vehicle but not stopping it. Too tight, and the cable might snap under the impact. Arthur needed tension that would hold firm long enough to arrest the vehicle's forward motion but allow enough give to absorb the shock without breaking. The anchor points had to be invisible. Steel cables stretching across a road would be spotted by any alert driver. Arthur designed a system using hedgerow stumps and buried posts, with the cables lying slack in the grass beside the road until activated by a pull rope that would raise them into position at precisely the right moment. And the timing had to be perfect. The cables needed to be raised after the lead vehicle had passed the anchor point, but before it reached the cable itself, a window of perhaps 2 seconds at normal convoy speed. Arthur took his plans to his platoon sergeant, a career soldier named Frank Morrison, who had seen combat in North Africa and Sicily. Morrison listened to the explanation with growing skepticism. "Let me get this straight," Morrison said when Arthur finished. "You want to string wire across a road and flip German jeeps like pancakes? Kübelwagens, Sergeant. They're lighter than our jeeps. The center of gravity is higher. They'll flip easier." Morrison stared at him for a long moment, then shook his head. "Kid, do you have any idea how many things could go wrong with this? The cable snaps. The Germans see it. The timing is off. They're going too slow. They're going too fast. The first vehicle warns the others. You're going to get yourself killed playing games when you should be fighting. War isn't a hunting trip in the Pennsylvania woods. It's not a game, Sergeant. It's a trap. And I know how to build traps. I've been doing it my whole life." Morrison's expression did not change. He had heard 100 ideas from 100 soldiers who thought they knew better than the army manual. The idea was impractical, too complicated, too dependent on things going exactly right. War was not a hunting trip in the Pennsylvania woods. Arthur accepted the dismissal without argument, but he did not abandon his plan. Instead, he began gathering materials in secret, collecting cable from wrecked vehicles, finding suitable anchor points along roads he had scouted, preparing everything he would need for the trap he knew would work. He would prove Morrison wrong. He would prove all of them wrong. For 2 weeks, Arthur worked on his trap during every spare moment, and in the chaos of the Normandy campaign, spare moments were more common than anyone admitted. The fighting had its rhythms, its ebbs and flows. There were periods of intense combat when every man was needed on the line, when sleep was a luxury and survival was the only goal. But there were also hours of waiting, of regrouping, of holding positions while supplies caught up or artillery prepared for the next push. During these intervals, most soldiers slept or wrote letters or played cards. Arthur slipped away from his unit, scouting roads and gathering materials. The hardest part was finding the right location. He found the perfect location 3 miles south of Mortain, where a narrow lane ran between high hedgerows for nearly 200 yards before curving sharply around a stone farmhouse. The farmhouse was abandoned, its inhabitants fled, its walls pocked with bullet holes from some earlier skirmish. The lane was used regularly by German supply convoys. Arthur had observed them himself, timing their passages, counting their vehicles, noting the intervals between them. They came through in the early morning, usually between 0600 and 0700, when the mist was thick enough to provide cover from the American and British aircraft that prowled the skies during daylight hours. The hedgerows were perfect for concealment. Arthur could position his men within arm's reach of the road without being seen. The cable anchor points were natural, thick tree stumps on either side of the lane, embedded in the hedgerow bases, invisible to passing traffic. He spent 3 nights preparing the site. The first night, he dug shallow trenches where the cables would lie, covered them with grass and brush, and positioned the pull ropes that would raise them into position. The second night, he installed the anchor points, wrapping cable around the stumps and testing the tension. The third night, he ran through the entire sequence, practicing the timing with imaginary vehicles until he could do it in his sleep. The hardest part was finding men willing to participate in what everyone assumed would be a disaster. Arthur's squadmates thought he was crazy, spending his nights building contraptions instead of sleeping, talking about cable tension and flip angles when he should have been worrying about survival, obsessing over German Kübelwagens when there were real enemies to fight. Most of them wanted nothing to do with his scheme. They had seen too many clever ideas go wrong, too many soldiers killed trying things that should have worked but did not. But a few were curious. Private Eddie Thornton, a farm boy from Kansas who understood machinery, asked to see the site and came away impressed by the engineering. Corporal James Whittaker, who had lost his best friend to a German sniper the week before, was willing to try anything that might kill Germans without risking more American lives. Private First Class Miguel Santos, a quiet man from New Mexico who never explained his reasons, simply nodded when Arthur asked for help and showed up at the site ready to work. With these 3 allies, Arthur completed his preparations. The trap was ready. All they needed was a convoy. The convoy appeared on the morning of August 14th, exactly when Arthur had predicted, emerging from the fog like ghosts, the rumble of their engines growing louder as they approached. He had positioned his team before dawn when the stars were still visible and the air was cold enough to make their breath steam. They lay hidden in the hedgerows with a clear view of the road, motionless as the minutes crawled past, waiting for the moment that would prove Arthur right or get them all killed. The pull ropes were in their hands, ready to raise the cables. Their rifles were loaded but hopefully unnecessary. If the trap worked as designed, there would be no need for shooting. The mist was thick that morning, reducing visibility to perhaps 50 yards. Arthur heard the convoy before he saw it. The growl of engines, the crunch of tires on gravel, the distant voices of German soldiers calling to each other in the fog. Then they emerged from the mist, one by one, like a parade of grey ghosts. Kübelwagens, just as Arthur had expected, the lightweight German utility vehicles that served as the Wehrmacht's equivalent of the American Jeep. He counted quickly. 16 vehicles, spaced at intervals of about 15 yards, moving at perhaps 30 miles per hour. Officers in several of the vehicles, visible by their peaked caps and the confident way they sat in their seats. Supply crates strapped to the rear of others. This was exactly the target he had been waiting for. Arthur's heart was racing, but his hands were steady. He had practiced this moment 100 times in his mind. He knew exactly what to do. The lead vehicle passed the anchor point. Arthur counted 1, 2, he pulled the rope. The cable rose from the grass with a whisper, snapping taut across the road at exactly the height he had calculated. The lead Kübelwagen hit it before the driver could possibly react. The physics worked exactly as Arthur had predicted. The cable caught the vehicle just below the hood, arresting its forward motion instantly. The rear of the vehicle, still carrying all its momentum, rotated up and over. The Kübelwagen flipped through the air and crashed onto its roof, sliding across the road in a shower of sparks and debris. The second vehicle was close behind. Its driver saw the impossible sight of the lead vehicle flying through the air, but there was no time to brake, no time to swerve. It hit the cable and flipped, crashing into the overturned wreck of the first, the third, the fourth, the fifth. Arthur watched in something like awe as vehicle after vehicle hit the cables and tumbled. The drivers never had a chance. The spacing was too close, the speed too high, the cables too invisible. Each Kübelwagen became a projectile, tumbling end over end and adding to the growing pile of wreckage. In 11 seconds it was over. 16 German vehicles lay overturned on the narrow lane, wheels spinning in the air, engines sputtering and dying. Some had landed on their roofs, their occupants crushed or trapped. Others had flipped completely over and landed on their sides, spilling cargo and men across the road. The silence that followed was profound, almost holy. No gunfire, no explosions, just the ticking of cooling engines, the hiss of steam from ruptured radiators, and the groans of injured men who did not yet understand what had happened to them. The air smelled of gasoline and hot metal, and the copper tang of blood. Arthur's team emerged from the hedgerows with their rifles ready, moving cautiously toward the wreckage. Most of the German soldiers were dead or too badly injured to resist. Those who could still move surrendered immediately, too stunned by what had happened to even attempt escape. 23 Germans killed or captured, 2 military couriers carrying documents that would prove valuable to intelligence, a complete disruption of supply lines to a Wehrmacht unit that would run short of ammunition the next day, and not a single American casualty. The aftermath of the cable trap brought attention that Arthur neither expected nor wanted. Within hours of the ambush, officers from the division staff arrived to examine the site. They came in jeeps and command cars, stepping carefully around the overturned Kübelwagens, photographing everything, measuring cable positions with tape measures and notepads, interviewing Arthur about his methods, with the intensity of engineers studying a new machine. What had started as a secret project by a private who should have been minding his own business had become a tactical innovation worthy of official notice. Word spread up the chain of command. A general from Corps headquarters arrived the next day, walking the site with his staff officers, asking questions about cable tension and timing, and the physics of vehicular rotation. Sergeant Morrison, who had dismissed Arthur's plans 2 weeks earlier, stood in the road looking at the wreckage with an expression that mixed embarrassment and respect. He had spent the morning fielding questions from officers who wanted to know how a private in his platoon had developed a technique that no one in the army had thought of. "I told you it wouldn't work," Morrison said. "Yes, Sergeant. I was wrong." "Yes, Sergeant." Morrison almost smiled. "Don't let it go to your head, kid. You got lucky once. That doesn't make you a genius." But the officers who examined Arthur's trap did not attribute the success to luck. They saw a carefully engineered system based on sound physics and detailed observation. They saw a soldier who had applied unconventional knowledge to a military problem and achieved results that conventional methods could not match. Arthur was promoted to corporal and transferred to a specialized unit that worked on obstacle construction and booby traps. He spent the rest of the war teaching other soldiers how to build cable traps, how to calculate flip angles and tension requirements, how to think like trappers rather than hunters. It was strange work for a combat soldier, more like a classroom than a battlefield, but Arthur found satisfaction in passing on the knowledge his father had given him. The techniques he developed spread through the army, adapted and modified for different situations and different vehicles. Cable traps were used against German motorcycle couriers, against supply trucks, against retreating convoys. The basic principle, using a vehicle's own momentum to destroy it, proved versatile and effective. Arthur returned to Pennsylvania in 1946, decorated but unchanged in the ways that mattered most. He took over his father's trapping business, married a local girl named Sarah who had waited for him through the war years, and raised 4 children in the mountains, where he had learned everything he knew about catching things. His father lived long enough to see his grandchildren born, dying peacefully in 1952 after a lifetime in the woods he loved. Arthur rarely spoke about the war. When his children asked about his medals, a Bronze Star, a Purple Heart from a wound he never explained, several campaign ribbons, he deflected with vague answers about doing his job and being lucky. The cable trap, the overturned Kübelwagens, The 11 seconds that had proven everyone wrong, these remained private memories, shared only with Sarah in occasional quiet moments. But sometimes on winter evenings when the fire was low and the children were asleep and the house was quiet, Arthur would sit on his porch and think about that morning in Normandy. He would remember the mist hanging over the hedgerows, the sound of engines growing louder, the moment when the cable snapped taut and the first vehicle began its impossible rotation through the air. He would remember the faces of the men who had helped him, Eddie and James and Miguel, and wonder where they were now, whether they had survived the rest of the war, whether they ever thought about those 11 seconds. He had been called crazy. He had been told his idea would never work. He had been dismissed by men who knew more about war than he would ever know. And then he had watched 16 German vehicles flip in 11 seconds, proving that sometimes the quiet kid who thinks differently is the one who sees what everyone else has missed. His father had taught him that the best trap uses the animal's own strength against it. Arthur had applied that lesson to machines, to vehicles, to an enemy that never expected danger from a simple steel cable stretched across a road. The officers called it tactical innovation. The army called it obstacle warfare. Arthur called it trapping. In 1987, a military historian researching unconventional tactics in World War II tracked Arthur down at his home in the Alleghenies. The historian had found references to the cable trap in army archives, a few photographs, some after-action reports, a mention in a training manual from 1945, and wanted to record an interview for a documentary about the Normandy campaign. Arthur agreed reluctantly. He was 73 years old now, slower than he had been, his hands scarred by decades of trap work, and his hair white as mountain snow. But his memory of that August morning remained sharp, as clear as the day it happened. The interview lasted 3 hours. Arthur explained the physics, the timing, the 2 weeks of preparation. He described the moment when the first Kübelwagen hit the cable and began its rotation. He talked about Sergeant Morrison and the men who had helped him, about the officers who had recognized what he had accomplished. At the end, the historian asked the question that everyone eventually asked. How did it feel to watch your trap work? Arthur thought for a long moment before answering. It felt like coming home, he said finally. I was in a strange country, fighting a war I barely understood, surrounded by people who thought I was crazy. But when that cable caught and those vehicles flipped, I knew exactly what was happening. It was the same thing I'd been doing my whole life, understanding how things move where they're vulnerable, how to use their strength against them. The Germans never saw it coming, just like the deer never see the snare. That's what trapping is. That's what I knew how to do. He died in 1994 at the age of 80, peacefully in his sleep on a cold November night when the first snow of the year was falling on the mountains. He was buried in the family plot overlooking the valley where generations of Jennings had lived and died, the same mountains where his father had taught him to trap, the same woods where he had learned the principles that would one day save American lives and take German ones. His children and grandchildren gathered to remember a quiet man who had never sought attention, who had spent his life in the woods doing the work his father had taught him. Few of them understood the full scope of what he had accomplished in Normandy. Arthur had never been one to brag. The headstone listed his name, his dates, his service. It did not mention the cable trap, or the 16 Kübelwagens, or the 11 seconds that had proven everyone wrong. But his grandson, a young man named Thomas who had inherited Arthur's mechanical aptitude and his quiet, thoughtful way of approaching problems, found the old notebook among his grandfather's papers, the one filled with diagrams and calculations, with measurements of cable tension and flip angles, with the careful planning that had preceded those 11 seconds in Normandy. The notebook was worn and water-stained, its pages yellowed with age, but the drawings were still clear, diagrams of hedgerows and roads, calculations of vehicle weights and speeds, sketches of cable anchor points and pull-rope mechanisms. It was a window into a young man's mind, a record of obsessive preparation that had turned mockery into triumph. Thomas kept the notebook, and sometimes, when he was working on a difficult engineering problem, he had become an engineer himself, perhaps carrying forward something of his grandfather's gift for understanding how things moved and how to stop them. He would think about the grandfather who had looked at an impossible situation and seen a solution that no one else could imagine. He would remember the stories Arthur had finally told him in the last years of his life about a morning in France when everything had worked exactly as planned. They had mocked him for his stupid cable trap. They had told him it would never work. They had dismissed him as a crazy kid who should stick to his duties and stop wasting time on fantasies. And then they had watched 16 German vehicles flip in 11 seconds, destroyed by nothing more than steel cables and the physics that a trapper's son from Pennsylvania understood better than any trained military engineer. The cables had done what rifles and mortars could not: stopped a convoy cold, without warning, without chance of escape. If this story moved you, take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel. Share in the comments what touched you most, and tell us where you are watching from today. These stories survive when we remember them together, and together we ensure that the ingenuity of ordinary soldiers who saw what others missed is never forgotten, never lost to the passage of time. The men who laughed at Arthur Jennings were not fools. They were experienced soldiers who understood warfare as it had always been fought, who had seen clever ideas fail and soldiers die trying things that should have worked but did not. Their skepticism was earned through hard experience, but Arthur understood something different, something his father had taught him in the mountains of Pennsylvania over years of patient instruction, something about momentum and vulnerability and the art of using strength against itself. He understood that sometimes the old ways contained wisdom that the new ways had forgotten. They called his trap stupid. Then they watched it flip 16 vehicles in 11 seconds, turning a German convoy into a pile of overturned wreckage without firing a single shot. And they learned what Arthur had always known, that sometimes the best weapon is not a gun or a bomb, but a simple understanding of how things move and how to make them stop. That is what Arthur Jennings taught the United States Army. That is what we should remember today.